The crystal stem of a $500 glass of crystal didn't just break. It shattered against the marble, the shards biting into Maya's skin as she hit the floor. Before she could even gasp, Julian's polished Oxford shoe was inches from her face. Around them, the elite of Seoul didn't move. In this ballroom, Maya was a ghost, a dirty little waitress, who had somehow snuck into a world she didn't belong in. Julian sneered. "Did you think a fancy dress could hide the smell of grease, Maya?" He looked down at her with a disgust so familiar it made her blood run cold. He saw the poor girl. He had discarded 3 years ago, the one who begged him for rent money. He didn't see the $50,000 custom silk lining of her dress, and he definitely didn't see the black screen phone in Maya's hand, currently connected to a private line that bypassed every security firm in Asia. In exactly 4 minutes, the heavy oak doors of this ballroom will be kicked off their hinges. In 5 minutes, Julian Vane's bank accounts will hit zero. And in 6 minutes, he will realize that the waitress he just assaulted is the wife of Kenji Sato, the city's most ruthless mafia king, and his time has just run out. The sharp crack of a champagne glass shattering against marble echoed through the ballroom, but it was the silence that followed that was truly deafening. Maya lay on the cold floor, her palms stinging from the shards and her heart hammering against her ribs. Above her stood Julian Vane, the man who had abandoned her in a rainy parking lot 3 years ago, when she was just a waitress with nothing but a positive pregnancy test and a broken spirit. "Security, get this vagrant out of here," Julian sneered, his voice loud enough for every billionaire in the room to hear. "She's probably here to steal the silverware." He looked down at her, with a disgust so familiar it made Maya's blood run cold. He saw the poor girl. He had discarded the girl who used to count pennies for bread. He didn't see the $50,000 custom silk lining of her dress. He didn't see the way the elite security detail at the door suddenly went rigid, their hands moving to their earpieces. Most importantly, he didn't see the shadow falling over him as the heavy oak doors swung open. Julian thought he was cleaning up his past, but as the room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, he was about to realize that the woman he just struck wasn't a waitress anymore. She was the protected heart of Seoul's most dangerous man, and his time had just run out. The rain in Seoul didn't just fall. It hammered against the neon-soaked pavement like a rhythmic warning. Inside, the midnight spoon, the air smelled of burnt coffee and cheap floor wax. Maya wiped the counter for the 10th time that hour, her shoulders aching from a double shift that felt like it would never end. At 22, her life was a series of missed bus connections and counting pennies for rent, a far cry from the glittering dreams she'd brought with her across the ocean. The bell above the door chimed, a lonely sound in the 3 a.m. silence. Maya didn't look up immediately. "We're closing in 5, she said, her voice raspy from exhaustion. When no one answered, she looked up. A man leaned against the glass door, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the streetlights. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than Maya would make in a decade, but it was ruined. Dark, wet patches blossomed across his white shirt, and as he stumbled toward the nearest booth, Maya realized it wasn't rainwater. It was blood. "Sir?" Maya rushed from behind the counter, her waitress instincts momentarily overridden by pure adrenaline. He collapsed into the vinyl seat, his face as pale as bone and his jaw set in a hard, defiant line. Even in his weakened state, he radiated a terrifying, magnetic authority. This was a man used to being feared, yet here he was, leaking life onto a cracked plastic table. "No police," he rasped, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. His dark eyes locked onto hers, piercing, obsidian, and filled with a strange sort of curiosity. Maya should have called an ambulance. She should have run, but she saw the way his fingers trembled, a flicker of vulnerability that mirrored her own daily struggle to survive. She grabbed the first aid kit kept under the register and a stack of clean bar towels. For the next hour, the world narrowed down to the space between them. Maya worked with steady hands, cleaning the jagged graze along his ribs, her movements gentle despite her racing heart. She didn't ask his name or why. Men in black sedans were likely scouring the city for him. She simply offered him the one thing she never received from the world: mercy. As the sun began to bleed through the smoggy horizon, the man stood up. He looked at the neat bandages Maya had applied, then back at her. For the first time, the coldness in his gaze softened. He reached into his pocket and placed a heavy, gold signet ring on the counter. "Keep it," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in Maya's bones. "One day, Maya, the world will try to break you. When it does, bring this to the Dragon's Gate." He disappeared into the morning mist before she could ask how he knew her name. Maya stared at the gold ring, the weight of it a promise that her life of serving others was about to end. And her life as a queen was just beginning. The golden chandeliers of the Shilla Hotel ballroom blurred into halos of light, reflecting off the polished marble like a sea of frozen stars. Maya smoothed the fabric of her midnight blue gown, the silk cool and heavy against her skin. This was her first time stepping into the light without Kenji by her side. A deliberate choice to prove to herself that she wasn't just a shadow in his kingdom. She carried the weight of her history in her straight spine. A stark contrast to the girl who used to shrink into the corners of the diner, hoping to remain invisible. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, melodic hum of Seoul's elite. Maya took a deep breath, tasting the notes of vintage champagne and old money. She moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, her heels clicking a steady rhythm of newfound confidence. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like an equal. That fragile piece shattered the moment she turned toward the balcony. I told you, darling, the guest list here is exclusive. You won't find any riffraff tonight. The voice was like a ghost's touch, cold and jarring. Maya froze. Standing near the grand windows was Julian Vane, his arm draped possessively around a woman draped in diamonds. He looked exactly as he had the night he left her, polished, arrogant, and wearing a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was laughing at something his fiancée said, his head tilted in that familiar, entitled way that suggested he owned the very air he breathed. Maya felt the old waitress flinch threaten to ripple through her muscles. Her instinct was to turn, to run, to vanish back into the safety of Kenji's penthouse. But then she felt the cool weight of her wedding band beneath her silk glove. Julian's gaze drifted across the room, casual and dismissive, until it landed on her. For a heartbeat, his expression remained neutral, the look of a man seeing a beautiful stranger. Then, recognition hit him like a physical blow. His eyes widened, his smug smile faltering as he scanned her face, her dress, and the way she stood unbroken and radiant. He whispered something to his fiancée and began to walk toward her, his pace predatory and fast. Maya didn't move. She watched him approach, noting the way his eyes narrowed with a mix of confusion and mounting rage. To him, she was a ghost that refused to stay buried. To her, he was the final monster she had to face to truly be free. Maya. Julian's voice was a low hiss as he stopped inches away, his shadow falling over her. What kind of game is this? How did a girl like you get past the front door? He looked at her with the same condescension he had used to discard her 3 years ago. But Maya didn't look down. She looked right through him. The poor waitress finally stepping into the lion's den, ready to show the predator that the hierarchy had changed. Julian didn't just speak, he projected, his voice slicing through the melodic string quartet like a jagged blade. He took a deliberate step into Maya's personal space, his face contorting into a mask of performative outrage. I know that look, he declared, turning his head to ensure the surrounding circle of CEOs and socialites was watching. That's the look of a predator who found a way inside. Tell me, Maya, did you steal that dress from the lost and found of the diner you used to scrub? Or did you finally find a mark pathetic enough to buy it for you? A ripple of hushed whispers erupted. The woman on Julian's arm, a slender heiress named Chloe, let out a sharp, tinkling laugh that felt like ice water down Maya's spine. Julian, darling, you actually know this person. She looks like she's trying very hard. Know her? Julian scoffed, emboldened by the audience. She was a waitress at a greasy spoon I frequented out of pity. She became obsessed. She's a professional stalker, a bottom feeder who thinks that by standing in a room with us, she can absorb our status. Check your purses, everyone. When people like this show up, things tend to go missing. Maya felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but it wasn't the heat of shame. It was the slow-burning fuse of a woman who had outgrown her cage. She looked at the faces around her. These were the people who decided who mattered and who was invisible. They looked at her with clinical disgust, as if she were a smudge on a masterpiece. Julian, Maya said, her voice slow and terrifyingly steady. You should be very careful with the stories you tell. The truth has a way of coming for people like you. Is that a threat? Julian roared, his ego bruised by her lack of fear. He reached out, his hand gripping her upper arm with a force that made her wince. You're a thief and a liar, Maya. You don't belong here. You're nothing but a ghost in a borrowed shroud. With a violent shove, he pushed her back. Maya's heels caught on the edge of a floral arrangement, and she stumbled, her shoulder hitting a marble pillar before she spiraled to the floor. The sound of her heavy silk gown hitting the stone was followed by the sharp, metallic clatter of her clutch opening, spilling her belongings across the marble. Julian stood over her, his chest heaving, looking down with a triumphant sneer. "Stay down," he hissed, "and stay out of my world." He didn't notice the way the ballroom doors had gone silent. He didn't see the 4 men in charcoal suits who had just stepped into the foyer, their eyes scanning the room with lethal precision. He only saw the woman on the floor, unaware that the shadow now stretching across his back didn't belong to the chandeliers. It belonged to the king. In the subterranean darkness of a high-security office in Apgujeong, a single red light pulsed on a sleek, obsidian console. Kenji Sato didn't need to look at the screen to know what it meant. The haptic vibration on his wrist connected to the biometric sensor in Maya's wedding band had spiked, signaling a distress level that made his blood turn to liquid nitrogen. He didn't shout. He didn't flip a table. He simply stood up, his tailored jacket falling into place, with a lethal precision that matched the coldness in his eyes. "The Shilla," was all he said. Outside, the quiet of the night was sliced open by the synchronized roar of 6 blacked-out SUVs. These weren't just vehicles. They were mobile fortresses, their windows opaque and their engines tuned to a low, predatory growl. As Kenji stepped into the lead car, his enforcers moved with the silent, terrifying fluidness of a shadow cabinet. They were men of few words and absolute loyalty, their faces masked by the neutral expressions of professional wraiths. The motorcade surged into the heart of Seoul, weaving through the neon-drenched streets like a black mamba. They didn't use sirens. They didn't need them. Traffic seemed to part instinctively, drivers pulling over in a trance of unnameable fear as the line of dark glass and chrome swept past. Inside the lead vehicle, the only sound was the rhythmic tap of Kenji's signet ring against the leather armrest, a ticking clock counting down to someone's demise. He watched the city lights blur into long, white streaks against the window. To the world, Kenji Sato was a businessman of unreachable height. To the underworld, he was the dragon. But to Maya, he was the man who had promised her she would never have to bleed alone again. Someone had broken that promise for him, and as the hotel's grand entrance loomed ahead, the silent fury in the car became a physical weight. The enforcers checked their tactical earpieces, the green lights flickering in the dim cabin like the eyes of wolves. They weren't coming for a gala, they were coming for a reckoning. As the motorcade screeched to a perfect, synchronized halt at the Shilla's red carpet, the valet staff froze, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The doors opened simultaneously, and 12 men in charcoal suits stepped out, forming a phalanx of living steel. Kenji stepped out last, his gaze fixed on the gold-trimmed doors of the ballroom. He didn't look like a man in a hurry. He looked like an inevitable force of nature. Maya was inside, and for the man who had laid a hand on her, the sun had just set for the very last time. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom didn't just open, they surrendered. The synchronized thud of wood hitting stone cut through Julian's laughter like a gunshot, and the string quartet's melody died in a discordant screech of bows. A collective chill swept through the room, a physical drop in temperature that silenced the whispers of the elite. Into the vacuum of that silence stepped 12 men in charcoal suits, moving with the cold, lethal grace of a storm front. But it was the man at the center of the phalanx who stopped the world's breath. Kenji Sato didn't look at the glittering chandeliers or the stunned faces of Seoul's most powerful families. He didn't acknowledge the panicked organizers scrambling to greet him. His gaze was a laser, cutting through the crowd until it found the one thing in the universe that mattered. Julian, still standing over Maya with a triumphant sneer, felt the sudden, crushing weight of a predator's focus. His face went ashen, his bravado evaporating as he realized the air in the room no longer belonged to him. Kenji moved with a terrifying, rhythmic calm. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, guests stumbling backward in a desperate rush to get out of his path. He ignored the gasps and the frantic bows of CEOs who had waited years for a meeting with him. To him, the room was empty of everyone but the woman on the floor. As he reached the circle of shattered glass and spilled contents, Kenji didn't say a word. He didn't look at Julian, who stood frozen like a statue of salt. Instead, the man feared by every underground king in Asia lowered himself to the floor, without a thought for his bespoke trousers or his public image. He knelt on the cold marble beside Maya. His hands, which could dismantle a man's life with a single gesture, were impossibly gentle as they reached for her. He ignored the blood on her dress, focusing only on the darkening bruise blooming across her cheek. His thumb traced the edge of the swelling with an agonizing tenderness, his eyes darkening into twin pools of obsidian rage. "Maya," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that carried more power than the silence of the room. He didn't ask what happened. He could see the story written in the glass and the cowards standing above them. Did he touch you? Maya looked into his eyes and saw not just the Mafia King, but the man who had promised her she would never be invisible again. The waitress flinch that had plagued her all night finally vanished, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. In the silence of the gala, the power had shifted irrevocably. The king had arrived for his queen, and for Julian Vane. The reckoning was no longer a threat, it was a reality. Kenji didn't bother to stand. He remained on one knee, his hand still cradling Maya's face, as if the room full of elite power players didn't exist. Without looking back, he snapped his fingers. The sound was as sharp as the glass Julian had shattered moments ago. Immediately, the massive digital displays, flanking the ballroom meant to showcase the night's charitable donors flickered and died. A low hum of confusion rippled through the guests, but the silence returned with a vengeance when the screens flared back to life. Instead of corporate logos, they displayed a waterfall of internal bank ledgers, offshore account numbers, and scanned documents bearing Julian Vane's signature. Julian Vane, Kenji said, his voice quiet but carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. A self-made titan of industry, or so the press releases say. Julian's face didn't just turn pale. It turned a sickly, translucent gray. He looked at the screens, his eyes darting frantically across the data. It was all there. The $3 million he'd embezzled from a construction firm in London. The shell companies used to hide his mounting gambling debts, and the forged credentials that had secured his seat at tonight's table. You see, Kenji continued, finally standing up and pulling Maya to her feet with him. When you took a hand to my wife, you invited an audit not just of your accounts, but of your soul. My team has been watching you since the moment you set foot in this city. We were waiting for a reason to dismantle you. You gave us a perfect one. One of Kenji's men stepped forward, holding a tablet that synced with the room's audio system. A recording began to play Julian's own voice, caught weeks ago, laughing as he described how he planned to drain the heiress dry, before moving on to his next mark. Chloe, the woman who had stood by Julian's side mocking Maya, let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she realized her entire fortune had been his target. The elite crowd, which only minutes ago had been ready to cast Maya out as a thief, now recoiled from Julian as if he were a leper. The lion was being stripped of his fur in real time. Every contract he had signed that evening was being cancelled by investors on their phones. Before the recording even finished playing, Kenji stepped closer to Julian, his height looming over the smaller man. You built a kingdom of cards on the backs of women you thought were disposable, Kenji whispered, but you made one fatal mistake. You forgot that some women are protected by the dragon. Julian's knees buckled. The sophisticated socialite was gone, replaced by a man who realized his life hadn't just been ruined, it had been erased. He was a ghost, and the haunting had only just begun. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, charged with the static of impending violence. Kenji's hand moved toward the inner lining of his coat, a subtle, practiced motion that everyone in the room understood as a death sentence. Julian understood it too. The man who had been a predator moments ago was now a broken heap on the marble, his knees trembling so violently they clicked against the floor. Please, Julian choked out, his voice a pathetic shadow of the roar he had used to shame Maya. He reached out toward her, but a sharp look from one of Kenji's enforcers made him recoil. Maya, I was wrong. I was stressed. I didn't know. I didn't know you were with him. Please, tell him to stop. We have a history, don't we? Think of the time we spent together. Kenji's eyes flared a dark, obsidian fire. History, he echoed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The only history you have with my wife is a record of debts you can never repay. He looked at Maya, his expression softening only for her. Say the word, Maya. He won't leave this building. The room held its breath. Maya looked down at Julian. For years, this man had been the monster in her nightmares, the giant who had made her feel like a smudge of grease on a diner floor. But as she stood there, draped in the protection of a king and the strength of her own resilience, she realized the truth. Julian wasn't a giant. He was small. He was a hollow shell of a man who relied on the fear of others to feel tall. The waitress flinch was gone. In its place was a cold, regal clarity. She reached out and placed a hand on Kenji's arm, feeling the cold tension of a strike about to land. No, Maya said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the silent hall. A bullet is too quick, Kenji. It's too merciful for a man who lives for his reflection in the mirror. She stepped closer to Julian, who was sobbing now, a mess of expensive silk and cheap cowardice. I don't fear you anymore, Julian. I don't even hate you. You aren't worth the energy of hatred. She turned to the crowd of investors and socialites, her gaze commanding. He is a fraud, a thief, and a coward. By tomorrow morning, every bank in this city will know his name for the right reasons. Every door he tries to open will be locked. He will walk these streets as a ghost, ignored by the very people he tried so hard to impress. That is his sentence. Maya looked back at Julian one last time, her eyes filled with a devastating indifference. You wanted me to stay in the shadows, Julian. Now, the shadows are all you have left. She turned away, her head held high, leaving the broken man behind. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a queen, and she had just delivered a stroke more lethal than any blade. The aftermath of the gala felt like the cooling of a fever. While the elite filtered out of the ballroom in a state of stunned silence, the digital execution of Julian Vane moved with the speed of a wildfire. Kenji's team didn't just stop at the screens in the hall. They pushed the data to every major news outlet and financial blog in South Korea. By the time Julian was physically escorted to the curb by silent enforcers, his phone was a graveyard of notifications. He stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk of the Shilla, looking down at the glowing screen. A notification from his bank informed him that his personal and corporate accounts had been frozen, pending a federal investigation into money laundering and wire fraud. A text from his landlord followed. His luxury apartment lease had been terminated due to character clauses hidden in the fine print he had never bothered to read. But the final blow wasn't financial. It was social. A guest at the gala had captured the entire scene on a smartphone the moment Julian struck a woman, the moment he begged like a dog on the floor, and the moment Maya's true identity was revealed. The video had gone viral within minutes, amassing millions of views under the hashtag the Vane audit. The man who had lived for the spotlight was now being burned by it. His fiancée's father, a shipping magnate, released a public statement before the hour was up, officially breaking the engagement and barring Julian from ever entering their offices again. Maya watched from the back of the tinted SUV as they pulled away from the curb. She saw Julian standing under the harsh streetlights, his expensive tuxedo soaked through, looking smaller than she ever thought possible. He was screaming at a taxi that wouldn't stop for him, his face contorted in a desperate, ugly mask of the man he used to be. He's gone, Maya, Kenji said softly, reaching across the leather seat to take her hand. His thumb traced the gold band on her finger, a grounding weight that pulled her back from the ghosts of her past. He has no name, no credit, and no friends. In this city, that is a fate worse than death. Maya leaned her head against Kenji's shoulder, watching the blurred neon lights of Seoul Street past the window. The slate wasn't just clean, it had been shattered and replaced. The poor waitress, who had been abandoned in the rain, was gone, and in her place was a woman who knew that true power wasn't about who you could step on, but who stood beside you when the world tried to push you down. For the first time in 3 years, the air Maya breath felt light. The debt was paid. 6 months later, the morning sun reflected off the glass facade of a refurbished building in the heart of Seoul's business district. It wasn't a casino, a luxury hotel, or a fortress. It was a sanctuary. Above the entrance, elegant gold lettering caught the light. The waitress's hand. Maya stood in the center of the lobby, her hand resting lightly on the marble reception desk. She wore a tailored suit of soft ivory, a color that signaled peace rather than the dark shadows of her husband's world. She looked around the room, which was filled with sunlight and the quiet hum of activity. On the walls were portraits of women, not socialites or heiresses, but nurses, cleaners, and servers, each one depicted with the dignity the world usually denied them. This foundation was the final piece of Maya's healing. It was a place where women who had been discarded, just as she once was, could find legal protection, financial grants, and a path toward their own rebirth. She had used every cent of the restitution, won from Julian's dismantled estate, to fund it, turning his greed into a lifeline for others. The heavy glass doors opened, and Kenji stepped inside. He moved with his usual predatory grace, but as his eyes found Maya, the sharp edges of his expression softened into something resembling awe. He walked over to her, his hand sliding naturally to the small of her back. He didn't come today as the underground king to intimidate or protect. He came as a partner to witness the legacy she had built with her own strength. The first 10 applicants arrived this morning, Maya whispered, looking at the stack of files on the desk. Each folder represented a life that was about to change. One of them is a girl from my old diner. She's being sued by a landlord who's trying to seize her savings. She thought she was alone. Kenji looked at the files and then back at his wife. She isn't alone anymore. None of them are. Maya leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She remembered the girl who had huddled on a cold ballroom floor, bleeding and broken, and she realized that girl was finally at rest. The waitress flinch was a memory of a past life. She was no longer defined by the man who had abandoned her or even solely by the king who had saved her. As the first woman walked through the doors, a young girl with tired eyes and a stained uniform, Maya stepped forward to meet her. She didn't offer a handout. She offered a hand, firm and steady. "Welcome," Maya said, her voice a melody of power and grace. "My name is Maya Sato, and I'm going to help you take your life back." The dragon had his kingdom, but the phoenix finally had her purpose. The story that began with a shattered glass in a house of lies had ended with a foundation built on the truth. Maya was no longer a ghost in someone else's world. She was the architect of her own. The rooftop of the Sato estate was bathed in the amber glow of 1,000 flickering lanterns, casting a soft light that rivaled the sprawling tapestry of Seoul's skyline below. Maya stepped onto the terrace, her breath catching as she took in the transformation. There were no cameras, no elite investors, and no shadows of the past. Just a path of white rose petals leading toward a small altar where Kenji stood, waiting. He wasn't wearing his usual dark, imposing armor of a charcoal suit. Instead, he wore a traditional silk hanbok in deep midnight blue, his expression stripped of its lethal edge. As Maya approached, draped in a gown of shimmering silver that caught the moonlight, he reached out his hand, his fingers steady and warm. "6 months ago, I promised to protect you," Kenji began, his voice a low, intimate hum that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath them. "I promised to be your shield against a world that didn't deserve your light. But in those 6 months, I've watched you build your own kingdom. I've watched you turn your scars into a map for others to follow." He took a small, velvet box from his pocket, but instead of a ring, he pulled out a simple, handcrafted gold band, etched with the image of a dragon entwined with a phoenix. "Our first vows were made in the dark, born of a need for survival. These vows are made in the light, born of my respect for the woman you have become." Maya felt a single tear track down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was the final release of the girl who had once counted pennies in a diner. She looked into Kenji's obsidian eyes and saw not a master or a savior, but a partner. "I used to think I needed your world to be safe," Maya whispered, her voice reaching out to him across the quiet terrace. "But you taught me that safety isn't a place or a bank account. It's being seen. It's being known. I vow to stand beside you, Kenji, not behind you, and never in your shadow. We are the architects of this life, together." He slid the band onto her finger, his forehead resting against hers in a moment of profound, silent communion. They turned together to look out over the city. From this height, the streets where Maya had once struggled looked like veins of pure gold. The neon lights of Gangnam pulsed with a new rhythm, no longer a threat, but a witness to their presence. They stood there for a long time, the king and his queen, watching the horizon where the dark of the night met the first hint of a new dawn. The debt was paid, the ghosts were buried, and as Kenji pulled her closer into the warmth of his embrace, Maya knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was home.
Please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our dramatic love stories. Comment below, and let's continue with this journey.